Coming up on today's episode of the Old Board Podcast, we take a deep dive into the Norfolk Southern versus Ancora proxy fight, and we give a shout out to a great railroad leader. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice-weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who's slowly becoming a highly trained broadcast specialist, and I'm blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And as always, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do is give a shout out to somebody who's been a very good friend of mine and an important part of my railroad career, and that is none other than GoRail's Emily Traiforos. Emily has been a leading part of GoRail for none other than 18 years. She is one of the people who's been there almost since the beginning of the organization. And for a little bit of background on GoRail, this is a grassroots organization that works around the country to promote freight rail. Because for many years, as you know, if you listen to this podcast, that railroads very much struggle to help the public understand the important role that they play in getting goods from point A to point B. And so much of the conversation over railroading is typically overshadowed by passenger rail and a lot of the shortcomings that passenger rail has. But Emily, who you see right here, has been part of their team and works in a variety of states. She and I got to know each other at Railroad Day on Capitol Hill way back in 2007. And so I got to know her a little bit as we were going around and talking to various members of Congress, including Corinne Brown, who at the time was one of the leaders on rail policy. And then later on, I saw that there was a job posting for GoRail, which at the time was called Go21, Growth Options for the 21st Century. I ended up applying and worked under Emily for a good period of that time. She has been a true leader there. So if you have the opportunity to get to know her in the course of working with state elected officials, local elected officials, some of the transportation organizations, MPOs, and so forth that are out there, she is terrific, and she is somebody who's going to be a real leader in our industry going forward. So shout out to you, Emily, for a great 18 years making our industry much better. Now, on to the main event. We're talking about Norfolk Southern versus Ancora. And we did a few weeks ago another episode where we talked about this in the context of activist investors in the rail industry overall. But what I wanted to do is give you a little bit of a deep dive into where things stand now and where everything is headed. So the first thing that happened is recently Paul Duncan, who was the Norfolk Southern's chief operating officer, say executive vice president, chief operating officer. And for those of you who are watching on CP5 Cam, there is Mr. Duncan. He was recently given the boot from the Norfolk Southern. Now, I want to give you a little bit of background on who he is and why this matters. So he has a bachelor's in transportation logistics. He started college in 1998. I started college in 1999. I'm 43, so he's roughly in his mid-40s, which means he is part of a generation of younger executives who are currently rising to the top of the industry, just like Emily Traiforos, who we talked about a little while ago. He started out his rail career as assistant train master on CSX out of Garrett, Indiana, which is part of the former Baltimore and Ohio, and then he subsequently climbed the ranks in the operating department at the BNSF, and that included leading their network operations center in Fort Worth, Texas, capacity planning, service design, all of those different segments, and I do believe he had a little bit of intermodal there as well. And now in March of 2022, he joined Norfolk Southern, and by January of 2023, he had risen to become executive vice president and chief operating officer. This, of course, was 1 month before the accident at East Palestine, Ohio. Now, what's notable about it, and the reason why I mention intermodal, is that when Mr. Duncan was shown the door, he was currently implementing an operating plan that was very much focused around intermodal service. That's because intermodal, while it is still not quite the primary way that railroads are earning their money. It is the biggest growth segment, and it will be the primary way that drives Class 1 railroads from here on out. Coal for many years was that. Of course, we know coal has fallen off. Intermodal was growing, but intermodal, of course, along with a lot of general merchandise traffic and coal and grain, continue to make up a lot of that. But intermodal truly now is the leader and will be for quite some time. So Duncan was a younger executive who was, of course, implementing this new approach so that Norfolk Southern would be, in fact, very well positioned for what is going forward. Now, NS replaced him amidst the proxy fight with John Orr. And let's get you a picture here of John Orr from allthingstrains.com, which is probably my favorite website, and that's because that's our website. So here you go. Please make sure you go over to allthingstrains.com as the first thing you do every day to find out what is going on in the rail industry. So while you on CP5 Cam look at Mr. Orr, here's his background. So he has degrees in organizational mediation and environmental studies from the universities of Guelph and Waterloo. So he is a Canadian and started his education there. He has additional work with Harvard Business School, and then he spent 34 years with Canadian National in transportation and sustainability roles. He spent some time in private consulting, but what's the most interesting, I think, is that he was chief of wagon production at Helrom. Now, let me show you a little bit of what Helrom is, and here you go. We're going to play this video for you, and I hope you can see this. And the reason why I'm mentioning it again is because this goes to intermodal, so I will let you see what is happening. Helrom is a new way of moving topsy, trailer on flat car. So as you can see right here, this is a truck that is backing a truck trailer, and these are obviously European. Helrom is a German company, backing that truck trailer onto a rail car, which is swiveled away from the rails. Now with one employee, he's pushing a couple of buttons, and the car is swiveling back onto the rails as in a normal train. This is very, very interesting because what it's doing is allowing for a trailer or a container that is mounted aboard a trailer chassis to be moved aboard a train without using a crane. And this is something that I would say is the only railroad because, of course, the problems with cranes are that they must be managed in some form. So go ahead and pause that so you understand how that works. And put my handsome face back on the screen. But yes, so this basically is allowing you to add and remove trailers from a train without using a crane. So again, holy grail of intermodal and a great way to lower costs. And that very much fits in with what Norfolk Southern is doing in terms of its intermodal first operating strategy. Now, after leaving Helrom, Orr went on to positions with Kansas City Southern, where he was the chief operating officer there, and then executive vice president and chief transformation officer at the newly formed CPKC, Canadian Pacific Kansas City, when it came about last year as a result of the merger of the Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern. Now, that gives you an idea of what Norfolk Southern is doing to try to blunt a lot of the criticism that they are receiving from Ancora Holdings about the ability of their team to, number one, effectively operate a railroad in any form, but also, number two, to be innovative and look for ways to approach lower cost ways of doing business. Now, in response, I should also add, Norfolk Southern has made some nominees to its board of directors. And let's cover them here as well. So these two, and I'll go ahead and add them, are a couple of people who we know fairly well. On top is Richard Anderson, and Richard Anderson was the former chief executive officer of Amtrak. In fact, he was actually two CEOs ago. Bill Flynn was between him and the current CEO, Stephen Gardner. Now, Richard Anderson worked for many years, began his career in transportation with Continental Airlines before moving on to Northwest. And at Northwest, he was very much working closely with Gary Wilson and the rest of that group who had led a leveraged buyout of Northwest Airlines. Now, this was something that I followed closely because at the time I was working to start my own railroad, and so I was looking for people who might be similarly aligned doing entrepreneurial things in the transportation industry. And a lot of the folks who had been part of the Northwest Airlines buyout, which included Al Cecchi and Gary Wilson very much of Disney fame, were people who I had targeted. So I did a lot of following what Richard Anderson and the rest of his folks were doing to see if there was an opening where they might have some interest in some of what I was doing. Anderson led Northwest and then spent 3 years as an executive vice president at United Healthcare. And then during this period, Northwest Airlines, of course, ended up going bankrupt. And then Anderson left United Healthcare to join Delta. There, he was part of the team that ended up merging Delta and Northwest to create the current Delta Airlines. Now, later on, of course, he would go on to Amtrak, and he did not exactly, and I do apologize for that. Looks like another organization is trying to sell you something there. And look, that's a great magazine. You certainly should subscribe there, but not until after you subscribe to allthingstrains.com, because we're a lot better. We're a lot better, even though we love our other news organizations in rail that are out there. But Anderson's career at Amtrak was very much checkered. Now, on one hand, the carrier continued to operate, and it did go through the difficult times of COVID-19. On the other hand, and this is very, very noteworthy, a lot of changes were made that were negative, and the most notable of those changes was the dining car service. For years, you were able on Amtrak to go to the dining car if you were a coach passenger or a sleeping car passenger and get a full meal. Well, Richard Anderson, during his tenure there, decided that was going to end, and so not only did they stop allowing the coach passengers to go into the dining cars, but they also stopped preparing food aboard the trains, and this was replaced with the so-called flexible dining. And don't worry, we here at All Things Trains do not like flexible dining in any way. It was probably one of the worst innovations in railroading history, considering that most people nowadays ride trains in large part because of the amenities, and one of those is, of course, the dining car. So getting rid of that was an unforced error that was incredibly terrible. And yeah, I know, I'll tell you how I feel about it. Another thing that Anderson did is he restricted the ability of private car owners to attach their cars to Amtrak trains. For many years, private car owners were able to go from almost any point to any point so long as there was the ability to switch the cars in and out. And this was a positive thing for Amtrak because remember, if somebody else is having their own car maintained to your standards and they're putting it at the end of the train, if there are any additional costs that are associated, such as extra locomotives and so on, those people pay it. And also, most of them contract with Amtrak to conduct the heavy maintenance on those cars to make sure the cars remain in compliance with Amtrak standards. So this is a net positive to Amtrak, even if the amount of revenue was comparatively low. Well, Anderson comes in and gets rid of it. Now, I think there is some real question as to whether Anderson was the person behind a lot of these changes or if it was actually Stephen Gardner, who was his chief operating officer. And I do believe, based on what I've seen, to be a large part of a lot of those changes. Now, that's not to say that Mr. Anderson was not infusing a lot of his airline background, and certainly having worked in the airline industry for a long time, it's not surprising that he might think that it doesn't really matter if you're serving people real meals. But one of the things that we tend to see as being a problem with airline executives coming over to passenger rail is that most of them don't understand the trip is so much longer and people have different expectations on rail, which is why the same things that work on an airplane don't exactly work on a passenger train. But that's just a little bit of a long explanation of who Richard Anderson is, and that he is one of the nominees that Norfolk Southern has proposed to add to its board of directors amidst the proxy fight with Ancora Holdings. The other one is Heidi Heitkamp. Heidi Heitkamp was a U.S. Senator from the state of North Dakota. I believe she served one term. And previous to that, she was the chief, let me make sure we get this right here, she was the tax commissioner for the state of North Dakota, and she was also an EPA attorney at the beginning of her career. She's very much aligned with the Democrats, whereas Anderson has been aligned in some way with both the Democrats and Republicans. And I bring that up because both of the parties here, Norfolk Southern and Ancora, have made an effort to make sure that some of their nominees do have a political background. And that is very much to be expected because a proxy fight of this sort, where you may see influence at a major American corporation changing hands at the time where you have a government that is much more interventionist than in times past, is going to raise political eyebrows on both sides of the aisle. Therefore, both sides have made an effort to make sure they have the ability to reach each of those. Now, let me go over to the nominees that have been put forth by Ancora. And to do that, I'm going to move nscforward.com, which we will link in the description. But this is where Ancora, who is, of course, the other side of the proxy fight, has put out the list of its proposed managers as well as directors. And the first you see is Betsy Atkins. Now, she's a former CEO. She's worked with a venture capital firm, been involved in technology, energy, and so forth. She's been a member of boards including SL Green, which is a major real estate firm based in New York City, and Wynn Resorts. So this is also someone who, while is not substantially versed in transportation, at least not on that background, it does show the diversity of skills that are required for a board of directors, and certainly having the ability to understand real estate and technology and so forth very much fits into a railroad that covers every aspect of the economy. The next nominee is Jim Barber Jr., and Barber is also the nominee of Ancora to be the CEO of Norfolk Southern. He is a member of the board of directors of C.H. Robinson, which is a trucking company, and he was both chief operating officer and president of UPS until relatively recently. Following that is William Clyburn Jr. Now, Clyburn was not only a member of the Surface Transportation Board, but he is a Democrat who is, I believe, the son of Jim Clyburn, who was the South Carolina member of the U.S. House of Representatives that is largely believed to have catalyzed Joe Biden's campaign that ultimately swept him into the White House. So again, this goes back to what I was talking about a moment ago. When we look at the links between both political parties and the slates of directors that are being put forward, Clyburn, if he's successful in joining the NS board, will certainly be able to rely on his familial connections, but also his board experience, and that is going to include being able to speak to people such as Marty Oberman, who is the current chair of the board, and Robert Primus, who is expected to become the next chair of the board if the Biden administration does continue beyond 2024. So this would give Norfolk Southern the ability, again, to have very strong influence there. And even if a Republican administration follows, still the ability to talk from the perspective of a former rail regulator who is politically connected is also very helpful. Now you have Sameh Fahmy. Now, this is another former member of the Kansas City Southern management team. And so here you have somebody who was on, we have people on both sides of this having worked on the Kansas City Southern, and that also does show you what typically happens after rail mergers take place, which is that you will have members, including several high-ranking members of a former management team, who are no longer employed, and so they are always casting about, looking for opportunities, whether that means in private consulting or joining other railroads, and so this is an example of that. One thing to note here with Mr. Fahmy is that he is the former executive vice president of Precision Scheduled Railroading at Kansas City Southern. And the reason that's notable is because the Ancora side has very much cast its lot in with the idea of precision scheduled railroading, whereas the administration of Alan Shaw at Norfolk Southern has been attempting to get away from PSR. And as you know, PSR is probably the most polarizing aspect of railroading in 2024. Next, we have John Kasich, the former Republican governor of the state of Ohio, and also was the budget chair under House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Now, this is again noteworthy because it's building relationships with the GOP, and it's also building relationships at a high level, and this balances out the other gentleman who is formerly who was related to Jim Clyburn on the Democratic side. So you have this balance that's taking place with the board. Proposed directors. And then this is what I believe is the most notable addition, and we've talked about him a little bit, and that is Gil Lamphere. Now, Gil was a co-founder of Mid-South Rail, and he served on a variety of boards, including Canadian National and CSX, and he was the chairman of the Illinois Central. Now, his chairmanship of the Illinois Central coincided with E. Hunter Harrison's rise to power there, and that's where precision scheduled railroading got its first real piece of implementation. Now, the PSR from the Illinois Central era and the PSR of today are quite a bit different, but basically they had the same idea, or one of the same ideas, which is to make sure that railroading is scheduled as opposed to what had been previously happening, where it was mainly focused on moving tonnage as enough tonnage was available. So this is what helped to reduce crew cost and also gave a lot of shippers a lot more certainty in when their goods would be arriving. So therefore, Lamphere not only does have that background in terms of precision scheduled railroading, but he also has an entrepreneurial background, is helping to co-found Mid-South as being one of those early regional railroad carriers that did something quite a bit different when it came to the development of railroading in the Southeast as the 1980s wore on. What's also noteworthy about Gil Lamphere and Mid-South is that Mid-South, of course, ended up being sold to the Kansas City Southern. The Kansas City Southern and Norfolk Southern created an agreement called the Meridian Speedway, and this was a way that NS co-invested with the Kansas City Southern to improve some of the lines west of Meridian, Mississippi, to improve the ability to move traffic between the Southeast and the Southwest in the Texas area, Dallas, not Beaumont, but Dallas, Fort Worth, that area. So it was getting traffic into that area. Now, what's very interesting, though, is after Kansas City Southern merged with Canadian Pacific, well, suddenly a lot of these agreements weren't exactly as beneficial as they once were. And we did see that CPKC and CSX had reached an agreement to acquire the Meridian and Bigby and therefore start something similar to the Meridian Speedway in another area. Well, this certainly rankled the Norfolk Southern. And going back a little ways, where we talked about John Orr coming over from CPKC to NS, well, part of this agreement included Norfolk Southern paying CPKC $25 million as part of waiving his non-compete agreement. Now, to be clear, there is absolutely no way that one man, even a chief operating officer or chief executive officer, is worth a $25 million buyout. That is actually sports, baseball level buyout. So that's certainly not what's here. But what was interesting is that the language also included that certain commercial considerations were also included as part of this. And while they're not stating what those commercial considerations were, it is in all likelihood related to the Meridian Speedway and making sure that NS is able to retain the ability to operate move a substantial amount of traffic over the Meridian Speedway with a willing partner in CPKC, even as CPKC and CSX build their own agreement around the Meridian and Bigby. So this says there is going to be certainly competitive rail service, which is very much what shippers and railroads and employees and all the parties would like to see. Obviously, there has been competitive rail service up until now, but it'll certainly be more competitive. But NS is not going to find itself boxed out, especially while it is fighting this proxy battle. And then we will give you one more person who has been added to the list of the slate from Ancora, and this is Allison Landry. Allison Landry is an equity analyst who's covered railroads with Credit Suisse, and of course we know that Credit Suisse, the lamented and great and sometimes not so great investment bank and wealth management firm, and she's also a member of the XPO board of directors. And I also think that being part of the XPO and XPO Logistics Board of Directors is notable because that is a company that was basically started by an entrepreneur and has grown into becoming one of the most widely visible trucking and logistics companies out there currently. So the mix that Ancora has put out is very interesting and is going to play an important role in not only whether the shareholders end up voting for the Ancora slate or portions of the Ancora slate, but also what they'll be able to do if they end up succeeding in their effort. Now, I wanted to take a moment here and cover who Ancora actually is. First of all, it is not just a, quote, hedge fund. And I mention that because a lot of the conversation that I see on railroad forums and among employees and so forth simply is focused on the idea that the hedge funds are coming to get the railroads. Well, that's not accurate. And the reason why I mention that is we need to be very accurate in how we discuss these issues. Ancora does have hedge funds, but they also have equity funds, mutual funds, and they have an insurance agency where they will write policies or place policies for everything from auto to marine and pleasure boat insurance and so on. They have $8.8 billion in assets under management, or AUM. And I think that's important for those of us in the railroad industry to understand what that term means. Assets under management simply means how much money that a given investment firm has from its clients to manage. And that differs from AUC, assets under custody, which is related to what a custodian has. That's because investment management firms like Ancora, they are tasked with managing money, but they do not actually hold on to the money. The money is actually being held by custodians like State Street Bank. Why is that noteworthy? Well, it is simply because we are going to see much, much more in the way of firms like Ancora involved in rail transportation in some form or another. And so we as followers need to understand who these firms are and how they operate. So I wanted to make sure you see that. The effort from Ancora is being led by James Chadwick, and he is the president of alternatives at Ancora. Now, his activist investing background is so large that he has served on 7 public company boards throughout his various efforts. And that's interesting because somebody who has the ability to get himself, not just his nominees, but himself on 7 boards of public companies. Now, I'm not sure what the size of these companies are, but that does show that he's very much a bulldog and is somebody that the NS board and management must take seriously as they go throughout this process. What's also interesting about Ancora is that they are not one of the larger, more well-known activist investors, such as Nelson Peltz, who's currently running a campaign against Disney, or Bill Ackman, who was responsible for bringing E. Hunter Harrison to Canadian Pacific after his time at Canadian National had ended. What's notable, you think about those two guys, Nelson Peltz, he ended up investing in and becoming involved with what's called Triangle Industries. And Triangle Industries is the former Central Railroad of New Jersey. So in 1976, the C&J sold the majority of its rail properties to Conrail and then eventually received what were, I guess, originally trust certificates, but later on were able to convert into cash payments for the properties, rail properties that it had conveyed to Conrail. And so that left it with money. And it ended up becoming a small conglomerate in the 1980s, which Nelson Peltz, one of the famous activist investors, ended up investing in. And he ultimately reorganized and broke up the company. So it's very difficult to find out what actually happened to Triangle Industries or the Central Railroad of New Jersey, as was previously known. It's a long, convoluted corporate history, but it is notable his involvement with what was a former railroad. And then, of course, Bill Ackman, not only getting involved with Canadian Pacific and leading to the ouster through activist investing efforts of Fred Green, who was then its chief executive officer, but then Paul Hilal, who was his lieutenant, going on to start his own company, Mantle Ridge, which led to the removal of Michael Ward as CEO of CSX and the placement of E. Hunter Harrison there. That led to our next the next part of this, which is what is Ancora targeting? And I mentioned Bill Ackman and Paul Hilal for a reason, because the Norfolk Southern operating ratio since 2019 has been quite a bit higher than either CSX, where Paul Hilal and E. Hunter Harrison were involved, or the industry average overall. So in 2019, Norfolk Southern's operating ratio was 64.4, and the industry average was 60.2. In 2023, Norfolk Southern's had risen to 67.4 versus an industry average of 61.1. And remember, operating ratio is operating revenues divided by operating expenses. So the lower this number is, that means the more of your operating revenue the company is able to hold on to. It was not uncommon to see operating ratios in the 80s and the 90s, in the 1970s and into the 1980s. So I remember in the mid-2000s when we started hearing that operating ratios at some of these railroads would start with the number 6. It was just groundbreaking. So it shows you how far the industry has come with deregulation, and that has been a positive. What we're fighting about now, though, is making the railroads even more efficient and successful from a cash standpoint. And regardless of where you are on either Norfolk Southern side or Ancora side, that drive is a positive, because remember, as we say all the time, railroads are very capital intensive, and in order to support a capital intensive business, you must have capital. And capital is not going to be provided by people, and I mean individual investors or even your large institutional investors who have large amounts of capital to provide, either through the purchase of equities or the purchase of bonds or even lending. They're not going to do that unless there is a very good likelihood that the company is going to be able to generate solid and increasing returns. This is something a lot of people do not like to hear, because they tend to think of the railroad as just existing for the purpose of existing. But making a profit and generating good returns is critical, or else we will start to see a return to what was happening in the 1960s and 1970s, when it could be very, very difficult to raise any form of capital for any sort of improvements. And remember, each day the trains run over the tracks need to be maintained. Every time the locomotive is used, that's wear and tear on it. It's going to need to be maintained. And this is before we get to the regular things such as fuel or oil or otherwise. And when things wear out, they must be replaced. And replacing a locomotive is by no means the same as replacing an automobile. And oh, by the way, railroads have plenty of those too, in the form of a lot of the maintenance away trucks and so forth. And those have to be kept in good condition and replaced. So the need to have a large amount of capital to support this business is something that's critical. So again, while you may be on different sides of the fight of Norfolk Southern and Ancora, the fact this is happening and the fact that we're arguing over operating ratios in the 60s versus operating ratios in the 80s or the 90s tells us that the industry is very much in a positive state. Whereas in the past that was not so, and by no means a given. A couple of other items that Ancora is very concerned about: the reportable accident rate per million train miles for NS rose between 2018 and 2022, and then also total shareholder return was not in line with CSX or the industry overall, and Ancora would like to see all of those things change. So what is next? Well, on May 9th, there will be a virtual shareholder meeting where all of this will come together. This is quite a bit different from what you've seen in other situations when CSX was under fire by the Children's Investment Fund back in the mid-2000s. I remember the meeting was scheduled to be held at the Gentilly Yard in New Orleans, and I can't imagine how that would have been had TCI not pulled out and chosen to forego the pursuit if you had a large number of investors showing up to a railroad yard, which quite frankly is not by any means set up for large in-person gatherings. So this being virtual is something that's very interesting. And I can't tell you who's going to succeed. I know Ancora has been very, very pointed in a lot of the criticism they have given Norfolk Southern. They haven't let up, but I can also tell you that while this is being played out in the media, you can bet that both sides are out soliciting as many proxies as they can. And for those who don't understand, the reason why we call it a proxy fight is that as a shareholder, you have the ability to vote each share in favor of whichever director or shareholder initiative comes out. You can vote it in favor or vote it against. It's up to you. The more shares you have, the more votes you have. That's it. But you can also allow someone else to vote your shares for you, and that's called a proxy. Now, if you give your proxy to Ancora, they will vote your shares in favor of their initiatives. If you give the proxy to Norfolk Southern or to organizations that are friendly to them, those proxies will be voted in favor of Norfolk Southern's side. That's why we call this a proxy fight. It's the goal to get as many proxies as possible, or as many people who are favorable to your side in whatever the conflict is. So they are soliciting proxies aggressively on each side, and it will come down to who is the most effective at doing so. And at the end of the day, it's one gigantic political campaign, so it's something to watch. And what I hope you'll do is go to 3 important places where you'll be able to find out information. The first is allthingstrains.com/rail news. That's where we're going to keep you updated day after day after day. And I've decided that we're going to create a separate section that is focused solely on Norfolk Southern and the battle against Ancora. That will continue for the duration of this through the May 9th shareholder meeting. The second place that you can find it is at norfolksouthern.investorroom.com/news. And that is the NS official site, where they are continuing to post all of their press releases, but you will see substantial Ancora content there. And the third place is movenscforward.com. That's movenscforward.com. And that is Ancora's site. And NSC, of course, is Norfolk Southern's stock symbol, so that's why they are using it. Now, we will be back with you on Wednesday. That is the 27th, with our next episode, where we will finally talk about luxury trains. And we're looking forward to it. We'll get some movies in there. We'll get a little bit of everything. So I hope you will join us then. Please like, share, subscribe, and if you know anybody who likes trains, that might partway like trains, or even might like to just understand the rail industry, works in the industry, may invest, public policy, you name it, please take this podcast and share it through whatever means you listen. We are on video on YouTube, YouTube and Rumble for now, and we will be adding Vimeo shortly. And then we are also on a large number of the audio podcasts, whether we're talking about Apple, Spotify, Amazon, you name it, we are everywhere. So there's no reason not to miss this. We'll see you on Wednesday, and we'll see you down the main line. Thanks for choosing All Things Trains.